Okay. Welcome to people joining us at home. And I think I've had some technical challenges this evening, but I think we're getting live now. So to you at home, we're going to be starting in about 5 minutes or so. So if you're not watching live, you might want to fast forward about 5 minutes. If you are watching live, then you can't fast forward 5 minutes. So that would mean you're traveling in time. She is, yes.
Do you know where she is in Australia?
It's in Sydney.
You see?
I think so. Yeah, but I'm not entirely sure. I think it's that. Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
Now we're just looking at it.
There we live now, I think. Yeah. I know. Come and.
We're not going to have to tell you to.
I'm just going to take this far away.
Have you heard of it?
I'm sorry.
No. We're just joking about it. And then online, AV only, sat here. Yeah. And we I was 20 I've been there when I was overseas. Yeah. It was so right wing, so like they had this speaker waiting Israel and saying to go to the heaven. I don't necessarily agree with what they're doing, because the methods are good. But this was my spiritual basis. And the women screaming in shock when he talked. Tell us about the white throne. Tell us about just noticing, shall we start shouting down? Tell us about I don't know anything about it. You don't. But it was really smooth and scary. It's like he's not dead. And actually, a couple of fences, churches that really last don't touch it. That's why we came to use it.
Yeah.
Anyway,
No. Right. Are we? Okay. Are we mostly here? There's notes available at the back somewhere. So do pick up a sheet of notes on your way through. All right. Are we ready to make a start? Okay, welcome everybody. This evening So just a couple of things before we get going. Again, as with last week, I feel like that worked a little bit better last week. Sorry, John, do you mind just turning me down a little bit? I'm just buzzing. So, maybe, oh, it's the other one. Sorry, I put that one up too loud. That's my bad. So awesome. Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Okay, so I think it worked quite well last week, or I hope it did. So what we're going to do is at various stages throughout the evening, I'll pause if we've got questions, comments, feedback, criticisms, whatever. Then we'll pass around the microphone so that everyone can hear, and we can get involved like that. Also, a few people have said to me that some of the things that we've been looking at have been, going over people's heads. So please, it's hard to know how to pitch it a little bit. So if you feel like that, please don't feel embarrassed about saying, Tim, can you just explain that a little bit better again, please? Because I don't mind doing that. I want to do it so that we can all understand together. All right, so that being said, really do welcome questions and inputs and so on. Let me go ahead and pray, and then we'll get into soteriology. Father, thank you that we can come together this evening. People from lots of different backgrounds, lots of different experiences, lots of different work and home environments. Thank you that we can come together because we are one in you. And Lord, what a privilege it is to be your children, what a privilege it is to be together as your church. Father, as we consider such a crucial topic this evening about how this whole thing of salvation works, Lord, would you help us to understand, help us to apply. And Father, I pray that this would lead us to a greater revelation of your goodness, a greater revelation of your grace and mercy towards us, and that would in turn cause us to worship in greater and deeper ways, I pray. So help us this evening, Lord, help me as we go through this subject together. Amen. I'm not feeling quite on the game this evening, I'm a little bit under the weather, so but I'm up for the subject because this is probably actually, out of all of the 8, this is probably my favourite. Soteriology comes from the Greek word soteria, which just means salvation. And really what we are thinking about tonight, last week we looked at the person of Christ, who he is, and particularly focusing last week that Christ is fully God, eternally God, fully man. And so just looking at the first paragraph of the notes there, the work of Christ. When we're talking about the work of Christ, we could talk about his earthly ministry in terms of miracles, teaching, parables, compassion upon the poor, all of those different sort of things. But really what we're focusing in on is the work of Christ on the cross, this idea of atonement. Atonement, I think, is a made-up word which just puts the words at one, how we become at one with Christ, a reconciliation with God through Christ. And so that's, I've put arguably the most important aspect of his ministry. I would say it is. Not everyone would, but we'll leave that for the moment. Really, the question that I want us to consider this evening is, in what way does the cross, does Jesus' death and resurrection, how does that make us right with God? How does that reconcile us to a holy God? And then I hope you're not too off-put by the handouts, because I know there's some kind of complicated sounding theories on the handouts there. Really, they're all ways in which people, theologians, philosophers, and so on, have attempted to think about this question: how does atonement work? How is it that the idea of Jesus, this person who is fully God, fully man, dying and being raised to life again, how is it that that can make us right with God? How is it that that can atone for our sins? How is it that that can reconcile to a holy God. An excellent book on this subject is John Stott's The Cross of Christ, which really goes into this stuff in a lot more detail. You've read it already? Yeah. I mean, if you've read that, you don't need to be here, really, because that's like, I know. So how does the cross make us right with God? And the theories that I've given you on the first half of the front page there, really, I think they can fall into two basic categories. And remember that these are ways in which theologians have tried to understand the atoning work of Christ. They really fall into two key categories. The first is what we might call subjective categories of the atonement. In other words, what does Christ's death and resurrection do for us? Okay, how does that actually affect and impact on our lives? And then really the second two are what we might call objective theories of the atonement. And how does Christ's death and resurrection affect God? Okay, does that kind of make sense? So subjective, the first three that we'll look at, and hopefully this will become clear, but if it doesn't, do stop me and we'll go over this. The first three theories that we're looking at are really, how does the death and resurrection of Christ, how does that impact us on a kind of daily basis? And then the fourth and fifth, how does the death and resurrection of Christ impact God? That's the kind of objective side of things. Now I'm hoping that will become a little bit more clear if it's a little bit murky at the moment. Let's go through these. The first one, and I've given you probably too much information on the handouts, but there. The first idea is that the death and resurrection of Christ is an example of what supreme agape sacrificial love looks like. Okay, so in what way, remember we're trying to answer the question, in what way does the cross make us right with God? Okay, well some people would say that the first theory that's on the list there is that the cross gives us the way and gives us the supreme example of love that we are to follow in. And so by dying on the cross, what Jesus has done for us is he's shown us sacrificial love to the infinite degree. Does that idea make sense? Okay, so that's part of it. Second one, really, the moral influence theory, that it is not just an example for us to follow, but it is a demonstration of God's love towards us. So it's not just an example for us to follow, but it shows us the depth of God's love towards us. That God was willing to die for us, okay, shows us the extent of his love. And of course, this, all of these find various backings in the Bible. This is how we know what love is, that Christ laid down his life for us, and so on. So that it is a demonstration of love. And then really the governmental theory that, and you can read about that, but the basic idea is that as we look to the cross and see the punishment for sin, it should deter us from sin. Okay? If we see that the punishment for sin is so great, that should cause us to say, I don't want to sin in that sort of way. Now, do those ideas basically make sense? Can you see what I'm talking about? Where these are ways in which Jesus' death and resurrection impacts us today. These are things that it does for us today. Does that kind of idea roughly make sense? Any thoughts or questions on that? Yes, Janice. Yep.
So the governmental theory, then,
Yes.
if you follow that sort of completely,
Yeah.
would you say a descriptive way of that is to scare us into believing in Christ, believing in God?
Good question. okay, one of the points that we get into is that all of these theories on their own are incomplete, particularly these ones, particularly these subjective ones. And I mean, a lot of these theories were posited by various people, and they were taken to extremes. So Grotius, who came up with that governmental theory, he didn't like the idea that someone could die for somebody else's sin, right? He didn't like that idea, so, which I don't agree with him about that, okay? But, so he was trying to say, well, in what way can Christ's death atone for us without our sin being paid for by someone else? And what he said is, the way that it does that is that it should, effectively, I guess, scare us into not sinning by showing us the seriousness. What Grotius was really concerned about was the seriousness of sin. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So, does this idea make sense? Yeah, Bill. Use the mic if you would.
On that one again,
Yeah.
isn't its biggest flaw the fact that when we do sin, we're not saved?
Yes.
You understand that?
Yes, I do understand what you mean.
Got away with it.
Yeah.
Ultimately,
Yeah.
it will be reckoned. But in the day-to-day,
Yeah.
I think the biggest flaw in that sense of that particular
Yeah.
is that we just get away with it too often.
Yes. I think there's definitely some truth to that, Bill. And I think, I mean, the problem with these subjective views is they don't take into account the offense that sin causes to God. And I think potentially subjective views without combining that with an objective view, essentially leads to a universalist position, if that makes sense. What these three subjective views are basically trying to say is that it's human beings that need to change to accept somehow how atonement works for them. Okay? I'm not doing a very good job of explaining this. Let's go on to the objective views, and then, because it might make a bit more sense when we try and compare and contrast the two. Okay? So if we've not understood so far, let's just put that to one side and make a little bit of progress, and then come back and see if we need to review that. Okay. The objective views then are basically trying to say, how does the death and resurrection of Christ change our standing before God? Okay, so in other words, what has that changed not in us, but in the heavenly realm somehow? Okay, so if that makes sense, the subjective element is saying, how does the atonement change us? Right? The objective is saying, how does it change in the outside of us? Okay, and so the ransom theory, which is sometimes called the classic view, held by many of the church fathers, is the essential idea, and it really picks up on, I think, in Mark chapter 14, when Jesus said, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So this is sometimes called the ransom theory, and the basic idea is that Christ's death and resurrection was given in payment, okay, in order to ransom us, like as if we were kidnapped, and to ransom us from sin and death, effectively. And so this ransom theory, the classic view, emphasizes the victory that Christ's death and resurrection has accomplished for us over sin and death. Okay? Does that make sense? Are we? So the essential idea here then, God's victory over Satan, deliverance of humankind from bondage to Satan. So it really, it's a picture, okay? It's a picture, as we said, Mark 14, plenty of other places, you were bought with a price. It's the image of redemption here. Redemption, that is a word that talks about buying back from slavery. And so the ransom theory really is about Christ's death and resurrection has paid the price to buy us and has therefore won the victory over sin and death. Okay? Now, you might think, well, that's all well and good, and it is, okay? But if you push the image too far, which some people might do, you might then start to ask, well, who was the price paid to? Okay? And that's an area where we might start getting into a little bit of difficulty, because I think perhaps the first answer might be the price was paid to Satan. Okay? Well, maybe, but I'm not convinced that God owes Satan anything other than death. Right? Certainly doesn't owe him himself. And so we start to get into a bit of problem there. Well, who was the price paid to? Some people might say, and actually I think, I could be wrong on this, but I think C.S. Lewis was that the Narnia books, if you look at them carefully, and the movies and so on, they seem to follow this classic view, that the essential idea that the death and resurrection of Aslan is victory over the darkness, victory over the White Witch kind of thing. But does the price need to be paid to Satan, or does it just need to be paid and we don't really know who to? And so push that image a little bit too far and we might find ourselves getting into a bit of logical trouble. In contrast to that, or not really in contrast to that, but perhaps another dimension of it, and I think perhaps what we're talking about is different angles on the same thing here. The other way of looking at the death and resurrection of Christ from an objective point of view, in terms of not what it does for us, but what it has changed in the heavenly realm, if that makes sense, is the satisfaction theory. Okay? And this was posited by Anselm, who was Archbishop of Canterbury in the 11th century. And he maintained that satisfaction must be made for sin. In other words, there must be a penalty, there must be a payment made for wrongdoing. And so he essentially was saying, Anselm held that God owned everything, including Satan, so nothing was owed to Satan, there was no ransom that needed to be paid to Satan, but rather God must either punish our sin, okay, and because our sin is infinite against God, it's an infinite punishment, okay, our rebellion is infinite against him, or some kind of satisfaction must be made for that sin, okay. So the satisfaction view is really much more about appeasing the wrath of God. Okay? The idea that judgment must be made for sin, and that Christ, by dying and resurrecting, has taken punishment and satisfied the wrath of God. Okay? Does that kind of make sense? So see the slight difference there in the objective views. One emphasizing the victory over sin and death. We've been snatched from the jaws of hell, as it were, by a victorious Christ rising from the dead, conquering sin and death. And we sing songs like that, don't we? Right? And hallelujah for that. But the other slightly different aspect is satisfying the wrath of God, that actually something needed to happen in the heart of God in order for him to accept us into his presence. And we sing songs like that as well, don't we? Come on, Tim. Sorry. Till on that cross, as Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied. Now, interestingly, this view of satisfaction has come under fire from a lot of different Christian, even evangelical Christians, in the last few years, to the extent that some have changed the words of that song, till on the cross as Jesus died, the love of God was magnified. Well, the love of God was magnified on the cross, but I think, I hope as we see, we're also going to see that the element of satisfying the wrath of God is a biblical concept. I believe that. I want to tell you, I'm going to lead you in a very specific direction here, and not all Christians would agree with that. Some Christians would say that Anselm lived in very much a feudal medieval world where this idea of wrath being satisfied was pretty kind of antiquated, and actually today we know a little bit better. Okay, so a lot of people today have said, are saying, let's have the ransom view, let's have the classic view, right? But we don't really need the satisfying the wrath dimension anymore. Okay, I don't agree with that, but I'm just telling you that's what some Christians say. Now, is this starting to make sense? Is this starting? I see some nods, but also some uncertainty here. What we're trying to say here, then, just to recap, is that we've got some ways in which the death and resurrection of Christ has changed us, not our legal standing before God, but it's affected our emotions in a way. It's shown us the love of God. It's given us an example to follow. It's shown us the seriousness of sin, right? But also, something needs to change with our legal status before God, right? So the subjective view on its own isn't going to make us right with God if we take seriously the Bible's view on sin and so on. Is this making sense? Then when we come to the objective view, we've got these two dimensions to it. The one which sees the death and resurrection of Christ as a ransom payment. We don't really know who to, but it's the Bible definitely uses the language of a price was paid in order to win our victory over sin and death, right? And absolutely the cross, the death and resurrection of Christ was a victory, right? But it's also, from the other side, we see that, according to the satisfaction view, that God requires a payment for sin, okay? It is impossible, I would argue, for God just to ignore our sin, okay? Our problem is not, the classic view, the ransom view, really says that we've broken the laws of the universe and a price needs to be paid to kind of rescue us back. And that's true, but we've not just broken the laws of a moral universe, we've broken a covenant relationship with God, right? And I would certainly say, and I would lead in this direction, that our sin against God is so serious that it needs to be either satisfied in hell or satisfied by Christ. Okay? Now, Graham, you got a question? Grab the mic from there and
I was just thinking about the links to the Old Testament
yes.
and the sacrifice of lambs and things.
Yes.
Which of is there one of the two that fits with that more?
Great question. And I think in answering that, let me introduce another subject, and hopefully in a roundabout way we'll try and get there. Part of this debate and part of the confusion, I think, for some people, just turn your Bibles to Romans chapter 3. Verse 25, Romans chapter 3, verse 25, says, Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. Okay? Now, verse 25, Christ, or just the last bit of verse 24, Christ Jesus, who God put forward as a propitiation by his blood. Now, if you've got a different translation, whose translation says something different there? Janice, you nodded your head. What does yours say?
By the free gift of God's grace, all are put right with him through Christ Jesus, who sets them free. God offered him, so that by his death we should become the means by which people's sins are forgiven through their faith in him.
Okay. Anybody got another different? That's a very loose translation. What's that? Living Bible or Living? What have you got, Ed?
The proper one, the NIV.
NIV.
Sorry.
The nearly inspired version.
Yes,
NIV.
Sorry. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God.
Yeah.
And all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus.
Yeah.
God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement.
Right. Now, that's the word that I want us to focus on. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement. And you'll notice that my version, the ESV translators, have translated that propitiation. And this is, and we're going to get a little bit technical. If you can stay with me, that'd be great. What we're talking about here is a Greek word, hilasterion. And there's massive debate about how we translate that word. So, the big picture, God presented Christ as a hilasterion, right? God presented Christ as and I think the generic way of translating it would be atoning sacrifice. That's a very generic way of translating it. But the word hilasterion can really be interpreted one of two ways, okay? And the first way would be really the idea of expiation, and the other way would be that the ESV translators have taken would be the word propitiation. Now, what do those words mean? Propitiation is the idea of satisfying the wrath of God. So a propitiation means that atonement has satisfied the wrath of a I'm going to say angry God. Okay, it's satisfied an angry God's wrath. Expiation is the idea of that atonement is about removing shame and guilt and about cleansing and taking those things away. Okay, so more the idea that we've been, more the kind of ransom theory. And so the question is here, how do we translate that word? You know, God presented Christ Jesus as a hilasterion, as an atoning sacrifice. Do we translate that, or do we understand that more as God presented Christ Jesus to take away our sin, or God presented Jesus to satisfy the wrath of God? Do you see the difference? And I think this is where, to come back to your question, Graham, this is where the Old Testament sacrifices can really help us out here. Because I think the answer is both, right? And hang on a second, Bill. And I'll tell you why. Because on the Day of Atonement, and you read about this in Leviticus chapter 16, and it's right at the heart of the Torah, so right in the middle of the middle book of the Torah, right in the middle of Leviticus, you've got the most important, I think, the most important sacrifice of the whole Jewish calendar system, where one day of the year, the high priest would enter the most holy place to make atonement. Now, on that day, there are two goats, right? The first one, the high priest put his hands on the head of the goat, right? And then the goat is released, okay? Now, we use that expression, you may not have realized this, but we use that expression in everyday English. Scapegoat, yes, right? And that is the idea of the sins of the people has been symbolically placed by the high priest once a year and then removed from the people. So that's very much the idea of expiation. That's very much the idea of cleansing from shame and guilt. And that shame and guilt has been taken away from us, right? But there's another goat who wasn't so lucky, right? And that goat was sacrificed, and what happens? The blood is sprinkled on the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies to do what? To satisfy the wrath of God. So, can you see how the Day of Atonement there, we've got both the idea of expiation, sins being taken away, sins being removed from the people, and also the idea of propitiation, a sacrifice, blood offering offered to atone, to satisfy the justice of God against the people. Does that make sense? So both of those aspects, I think, we see in the Old Testament sacrifices. And of course, the writer of Hebrews, in Hebrews 9, really picks this idea up, saying how Christ has entered the Holy of Holies once and for all, where the high priest used to do it year in, year out. Christ has entered that most holy place once and for all, our once for all sacrifice. He has made both propitiation and expiation for our sins. Meaning what? He is both satisfied with the wrath of God and conquered sin and death, so that our sin and guilt is removed. Okay? Praise Jesus. Like, honestly, the more I look at, I don't know how people say theology is dry. I mean, I know it's technical sometimes, but what amazing truth as you kind of dive into this. You know, he did this for me. Anyway, is that kind of answering? Okay. So I think it's helpful, and actually I think this debate about the satisfaction theory of the atonement, it really rose up, I guess, about 10 years ago. There was a famous Christian author who many of you have heard of, so I probably shouldn't name his name, who wrote a book and effectively questioned whether we can really talk of God being angry enough at sin to cause his only son to die. And really, this author was saying, isn't that a little bit like cosmic child abuse? Or sometimes the way that we present that as Christians, isn't that a little bit like cosmic child abuse? And so that's really started this whole debate about whether this satisfaction, can we really speak of an angry God? You know, isn't that a kind of old-fashioned sort of concept of God? And I think having that debate probably shows that we don't really have much of an idea of how offensive our sin is to God. Any other thoughts or questions on those ideas before we move on? Yes, and can you pass the mic on, please? So, sorry, just so.
I was just thinking when they went out into the desert.
Yes.
So the sins were moved from the sea.
Yes.
You're saying this when our sins go into the sea.
When our sins go.
When God cleans our sins in the sea. In the Psalm.
Oh, yes, so I think you're talking about Psalm 103, as far as the east is from the west. So far, yes, that's exactly the same idea. Yeah, I think that's exactly the same sort of idea. Yeah, that's right. And yeah, what an amazing, yeah. Can you pass it back along, please? Yeah, go for it, Ed.
I think it's in the King James, sorry to go back to that.
Yep.
It says God was in Christ, sacrificing himself to the world.
Yes.
And there's an old theology going back to the symptom of patro-passionism, where people say that actually God the Father was in Jesus on the cross.
Yes.
Now, I'm not saying that is... But it's part of the answer to Mr. What's his name?
Yes.
He's saying that he is implying that God, it was nothing to God to sacrifice.
Yes. Yes.
And I don't think Scripture, I think the whole thing is that if we look at the Father running to the Son.
Yes.
The prodigal son.
Yes.
There is love and pain. Maybe I shouldn't use the word pain.
Yes.
There's a sort of pain within God.
Yes. No, I agree.
About this.
Yes.
And that is the answer. Partly.
Yes. Yes. I absolutely agree. It creates a schism in the Trinity that doesn't need to be there. I completely agree. I think there was pain in the heart of God as Jesus died. I also think there was immense love. Look at what my son is doing for you, I think the Father is saying as Jesus died. People of earth, look at what he's doing for you. I'm so proud of him. I think there's something of that as well.
Isn't the part of the problem that our words are limited?
Yes.
Like many spiritual things.
Yes.
And that's why we have so many different. It's as if there is a diamond.
Yes. That's exactly
an
it.
invaluable diamond.
Yes.
With numerous facets.
Yes.
And these words, justification, redemption, atonement,
Yes.
are only one facet of
Yes.
many.
Yes.
And
Yes.
in our culture, it may be true that we need to emphasize one type of facet. So redemption is a very common thing within films and books.
Yes.
And reconciliation.
Yes. Yes, I think that's true, Ed. Although I think there is a danger if we minimize, if we start to say the satisfaction theory isn't as important, right?
I wasn't saying
No, I know you were, or isn't as relevant or contextual in our situation. I'm not saying you were saying that, but that's certainly what some people would say. I think most of you know I'm a student at university at theology college. And some of my classmates there were saying, this whole idea of satisfaction theory, they call it something different, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But this whole idea of that is just so old-fashioned, isn't it? This is what they were saying. And one of the problems with that is that when we minimize the seriousness of the wrath of God, we become much more liberal about our own sin. Right? I think that there's a real danger that we lose sight of the holiness of God, of the absolute moral purity of God. And what I think starts to happen is when we start to say, some people, well, surely God's not a vengeful God, right? Because it sounds, we don't like talking about this in some sense. So, does he really punish for eternity people's sin? Does he really do that? And I think when the reaction of a lot of us as Christians is to start to back off that doctrine a little bit and to start to say, yeah, maybe he doesn't really do that. And so you see this in all kinds of different ways. Some people start to say, well, maybe he doesn't punish their sin forever. Maybe he just punishes it for a little time and then they're annihilated. So that kind of annihilationist doctrine of the end times. Or actually maybe they'll get a second chance after they've died to see the seriousness of their sin and repent, right? Or maybe actually everybody goes on to heaven anyway, because God couldn't possibly be so angry with sin. And once we start going down that line, we end up with a God who is not God. We end up with a God who is not holy, who has no moral authority, right? And the gospel falls apart. The beauty of the gospel is that despite the depth of my sin, I can still be reconciled, made friends with a God who ought to punish me eternally. And rather than saying, isn't that an old-fashioned view of the wrath of God and the vengeance of God, I would want to frame it in, look how amazing the grace of Christ is. Look how deep his love, that what it cost to make us friends again. It's stunning, absolutely stunning. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah, Bill, let's go back to... We got a question just while the mic's coming to you, Bill. I know it has now, but we had a question from the internet, which I think is about the government theory earlier. So if you're still watching on the internet, then is fearful faith from the fear of sin true faith in the eyes of God? I think that's referring to the governmental theory that we were talking about earlier. And then, yeah, as we were saying earlier, that's just kind of one dimension of the diamond that Ed was talking about. And then, yes, go ahead, Bill.
The footnotes in this NIV on that verse 25.
Oh, yeah.
Puts them both together. It actually says, as the one who will turn aside his wrath, taking away sin.
Yes.
So it's reconciled.
Yes.
Yeah? What was the other thing?
I think they are both present in. I think that's absolutely right. I can't remember which translation it is, but there's certainly one translation of the English translation of the New Testament, which is very cautious of this satisfaction view. And so it translates hilasterion as expiation, that atonement is all about removing our guilt, and it's not about satisfying the wrath of God. I can't remember which translation that is, though. So, what's the other?
The Old King James had in it, God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself.
Yeah.
Which is what you just said. Yeah?
Yes.
And I can't conceive of God splitting himself up. You know what I mean? It's sort of the Father's in heaven watching his Son die on the cross.
Yeah.
And together.
Yeah.
I even go so far, and shoot me down if you like, when Jesus cried out, Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Yes.
I don't believe there was a separation between. I see it as Jesus prophesying to the crowd the reality of that psalm.
Okay.
Because they lived in oral tradition, so as it says that, so many of them would then be rehearsing in their own mind what they were actually seeing.
Yes.
And he was sort of prophesying to this nation.
Yes. I hear what you're saying. I'm not convinced. I think that's a really interesting point. I would certainly agree that there's no separation in the Trinity as Jesus was dying on the cross. But I think I still think Jesus would have felt the absence of the Father as he carried the weight of sin, humanity. I think that was the pain of the cross. Because I think Jesus has to bear punishment that's beyond physical. I think he has to bear the wrath of God, and I would say that goes beyond the physical bearing of pain. I would say that goes to a spiritual. Now, how that works, I agree. We don't want Jesus is still fully God, but I would say that because he is fully God in that moment, that is why he can bear infinite judgment. I think he is bearing infinite judgment at that time. I agree that there's no separation in the Father and the Son there, but
one last thought.
Yeah, go on. One last thought then.
Without trivializing any of this, because I think it's tremendous that we can see different perspectives of one thing. I would suggest that in a way, all these theories to a measure are irrelevant because the reality is what matters.
It is.
We know, we know that through the death of Jesus, we are reconciled to the Father.
Yes. That's absolutely true. I would say that when we see more dimensions of the diamond, to use Ed's expression, it makes the beauty of the gospel more evident to us. And that's why we study it. Do you need to understand soteriology to be saved? No. I don't think you need to understand that Socinian said this, and Anselm said that, and this, and that, and that, and that, and that. I don't think we need a fully developed theology, but doesn't it make the grace of Christ just more brilliant as we see these different dimensions of the Christian faith? Yes.
I was going to say was when Jesus was crowned to God, why was then forsaken?
Yes.
Was he doing that in his humanity?
Yeah, great question. And I think that comes back to what Bill was saying again. When Jesus cried out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Yes, I'm not sure that you can divide the humanity and the deity of Christ quite so easily. I don't think you can say.
You could imagine him suffering so much, crying out to his
Yes, you can. But what I'm saying is, I don't think Jesus at some points was operating out of his humanity and at other points was operating out of his divinity. I would say that all the time he was operating out of his humanity and his divinity. So I think it is both the human and the God in Christ who is crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? But it's a great question and it's a mystery there. Janice, and then we're going to move on.
Sorry, I don't understand.
No. It's fine. Please.
If there was no separation between God and his Son,
yes.
Why did it go dark for 3 days?
Why did it go dark for 3 hours? Why did it go? Yeah, go on.
If there was no separation between God and his Son on the cross, then why did it go dark?
When I say there's no separation, what I'm meaning by that is that the Trinity was not divided. Okay? I'm using the phrase, there's no separation in the Trinity. I would use that I think we get into really dangerous territory if we start to say there was a split in the Trinity. Okay, I would say that's bad theological ground to be treading on. Now, I think that Jesus, as fully human and fully divine, has taken upon himself, on the cross, has taken upon himself the weight of God's judgment against the sin of the world. And that the darkness in the land is a physical representation of the judgment that Jesus is experiencing. Now, God cannot sin, but at the same time, he who knew no sin became sin. So there's a bit of a mystery about exactly how this works. And I think Bill's right. At some point, we just kind of lose language to really understand what exactly happened there. We're just trying to shed a little bit of light on it. But I think we have to be careful of some traps. Do you understand what I'm saying there? So there's a mystery, but at the same time, we can say some things that are not true. And one of those things is that the Trinity remains the Trinity even during the death and resurrection of Christ.
I think my perception of the darkness was no communication. I didn't take it as the weight of the sin.
Yeah. I mean, this is where Bill and I perhaps disagree a little bit, but I would say that Jesus did feel separated. Now, he wasn't theologically separated, if you understand what I mean. There wasn't an actual separation, but I think bearing the judgment of the Father, I think he felt separated, and which causes him to cry out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" But again, we're into a bit of a mystery here. Let's move on, and we'll see how we go. We can always come back in a few minutes. I think really we've covered this in lots of different ways, looking at these different dimensions of the atoning work of Christ on the cross. I think it's important that we retain some central ideas. And I've put, you can see that kind of subheading, the central theme of the atonement. We've already seen that a view of the atonement is linked to the character of God and the doctrine of humanity and sin. If we have faulty or insufficient views of these doctrines, our understanding of the atonement will also be in error. And I think that's where a lot of dodgy views of the atonement come from. Okay? Faulty view, A, of the holiness of God, B, of the depth of our offence against God, or C, of the extent of God's love towards us. Right? So those doctrines, I think we have to hold key in coming to an understanding of the cross. Does that make sense? The holiness of God, the depth of our sin and what that causes, how that causes God to see is the separation that we have with God and the extent of his love to us. So the character of God. God is completely holy, absolutely morally pure, cannot stand sin of any kind. Holiness is not opposite to love. So many people, I think, make this error. They say, how can God be a judge and also be loving? Right? How can God punish sin on the one hand and be so angry about sin and be so nice and kind and loving on the other hand? And actually, it's the cross that answers that question. It's the cross where God brings together these two aspects of his personality, not that they are opposite by any stretch, but these two dimensions where he says, I am so angry with sin, yet my love towards humanity is so great that I will bear the weight of my anger, my own anger against sin. So, love, justice, they're not opposites. I think a lot of people, in the way that we present the gospel, and in the way that people understand the gospel, tend to think that if God is loving, he can't also be judging. Or if God is judging, he can't also be loving. I think the cross proves that the cross brings those things together. So often I think people look at things in the world and say, how can God allow X, Y, and Z to happen? Right? The reality is that God could strike me dead right now and I would have no recourse, no response to say to him, because he is totally holy and I am totally sinful. Right? The only time where God has not been completely just is at the cross, where the only one who never sinned was punished for my sin. Right? So the character of God, love is not opposite to justice, the status of the law. And I think this is one of the errors in the kind of Narnia theology, right? That the law is not just the law of the universe. It's not just the moral law of the universe, but the law is actually a personal thing to God. When we break, when I sin, right? When I look at something dodgy on the internet, or when I gossip about someone behind their back, or I do this or that or the other, okay? I'm not just breaking a law, as in the sense that, when I'm speeding, I break the laws of this land, right? If I speed in my car, the Prime Minister or the Queen isn't personally offended, right? She doesn't care, she doesn't know. But when I sin, I'm not just breaking a law, I'm breaking a relationship with God. So the status of the law is such that I think it's almost a personal offence to God when we sin. And I would say it is. And I think it's okay to use those words. Personal offence to God. And that's why legalism, obeying the law for the sake of it, is also unacceptable, just turning over the page then. Because obeying the law is not just an external matter, it's a matter of relationship. Right? The human condition, the doctrine of total depravity, and I'm veering a little bit to Calvinism there, but if you don't understand that, don't worry about that. But it's not just that human beings are as wicked as they could possibly be, but rather that the idea that we are unable to save ourselves or do anything about the condition of our sinfulness. Okay? And that's something that I would hold to. That we are, as human beings, unable to rescue ourselves. Okay? Our understanding of Christ is essential at this point because last week we looked at the idea that the only way the whole sins of humanity could be atoned for is for one who is both completely God and completely man. Only man ought to pay the penalty for sin. Only God could pay the penalty for sin. There's a nice little phrase for it. Only man ought to. God doesn't have to pay the penalty for sin because he's never sinned. But only God is able to bear an infinite judgment. So only someone who is totally God and totally man can be worthy of the sacrifice for our atoning sacrifice. We've also looked at the Old Testament sacrifices, which were both propitiatory, satisfying the wrath of God, and also expiatory, removing sin and guilt. And I think that background is important because it sets the tone for how we understand Christ's work Christ's work on the cross. really what I'm coming to here is I believe that the central theme of the atonement can be summed up in 2 words. And these are the words that you will often hear theologians using, and I think for good reason. I think they're right. Penal substitution. Penal as in penalty. There has to be a penalty for sin. Substitute, we know what a substitute is. When someone's tired on the football field, they come on in their place, right? So, someone who has paid the penalty in our place. Okay, someone who has satisfied the wrath of God in our place. And I think for a lot of these theologians who are saying that's an old-fashioned, antiquated view of seeing atonement, I think you have to look at the way that the Old Testament anticipates substitutionary atonement, penal substitution. You know, Abraham going to offer Isaac in Genesis 22. The whole Levitical system of sacrifices was a foreshadow of penal substitution, substitutionary atonement. I think that anticipates, the Old Testament anticipates that. In the New Testament, we see, again, I think Ed's alluded to this earlier, we see different pictures and dimensions as Paul is trying to understand, and a lot of Paul's writing is trying to understand atonement, this idea of Christ's death and resurrection. So we see Paul using, again, different pictures looking at the same thing, okay? And if you've ever thought about this, but think about the words. They're theological words to us, but for Paul, they were like everyday words from images and metaphors that people would understand, okay? So, for example, redemption, which we've talked about, redemption means to buy back. Redemption is the language of the marketplace in Paul's day, right? If someone was a slave, they could be redeemed, bought out of slavery for a price. If someone was to pay the slave owner, I'm going to redeem slavery, they could redeem themselves. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. He has redeemed us from slavery to sin, right? It's the image of the marketplace in Paul's day, the Roman marketplace, buying us back out of slavery, back to our original owner. The language of justification, again, a big kind of theological word, but for Paul, it's the everyday language of the law courts. Okay, the idea of justification is being declared not guilty. Right? That we have been justified. To be justified meant in Paul's day that a judge would declare someone to be not guilty. We have been justified by Christ's death and resurrection. Why? Because he has expiated our sins. He has removed our sins and guilt from us. Therefore, when God looks at us, he sees us as clean, as justified, declared not guilty. We see in the language of reconciliation, which is the language of friendship, the language of family, of two enemies becoming friends again. So Paul really amplifies this theme in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. We have been reconciled to a holy God. What's that song we sometimes sing? I am a friend of God. Well, that's Bible truth, right? I am a friend of God. You're laughing at my dodgy singing. Right? I am a friend of God. We can declare that truth because Christ has reconciled us to holy God, who should send us to hell. We've been reconciled to him. And of course, we see the language of sacrifice, which is the language of the temple courts, satisfying the wrath of God and so on. How are we doing, folks? See some tired faces. Is this making sense? Right, let's take a bit of time. I'm done. I'm through my stuff. So, David, yes. So, can someone pass the talking stick to David?
Jim, an important question about the atonement I don't think we dealt with.
Good question.
Is who did Jesus die for? Did he die for all men and women everywhere? Or did he die for the chosen, the elect, the called?
We'll come back next week.
Well, how long have we got now, David?
It seems to me a big issue.
It's a massive issue. And if you want my opinion, can I give my opinion briefly? I think Jesus died for the elect. I think I'm a
You're a good Calvinist.
I'm a great Calvinist. I invite Calvin into my heart. I think, I'm kidding. I'm kidding by that, by the way. That was a little theological joke, and I apologise if that didn't make sense. Here's what I believe. Here's what I think. Here's how I came to understand the whole idea of do we understand David's question? Who did Jesus die for? And I would say, did Jesus die for everybody, or did he only die for the elect? I would say, if Jesus died for everybody, there shouldn't be anybody in hell. It wouldn't be just of God to punish sin on Christ and in hell. Right? Now, we're talking about a pretty tricky concept here, and for those of you who are interested, this is the debate between Calvinism and Arminianism. I would say that Christ died for the elect because limited atonement, for the reason being that sin should only be punished either in hell or on the cross, but not both. So if Christ died for everybody, then there shouldn't be anybody in hell. Now that's what I think. Okay. The flip side of that, the other way of looking at it, is that Christ died for everybody, and people have to decide whether they want to be part of it or not. Whether it's like a free gift that you have to open. So Christ has given the free gift to everybody, and you have to open it for yourself. And that's the kind of Arminianist position. And I told you what I believe. I'm sure some of you will agree, some of you will disagree, and that's fair enough. But it is a massive, massive issue, and I agree with you. It's a really good point. Yeah, go for it.
Was his death sufficient for the whole world?
Was Jesus' death sufficient for the whole world? I think we have to say yes, it was. And here's the issue. And I perhaps answered the question, David, a little bit too quickly, because the reality is that there are verses that seem to lean towards a Calvinistic doctrine of atonement, and there are verses that seem to lean towards an Arminian doctrine of atonement. And actually, if you really push me, I'd probably swing a little bit less and go somewhere in the middle. I've still told you what I believe, but I think it is a little bit murky. Was Christ? Yes, I think the answer has to be yes. Was Christ's death sufficient for all? I think you have to say yes.
But that's not limited atonement. Now, what you're saying is particular redemption, to be theological about it, isn't it?
No, I still think you can hold the two together. I think you can hold the two together. I think we're getting into a little bit technical detail here, and going down a rabbit hole, which I kind of want to go down. I'm going to have to think about that a little bit more. Sorry, Ed. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah, let's let Jill have a go.
Whilst I've got the mic,
yeah.
If anybody wants to see an illustration, I think the most perfect painting, I don't like religious paintings, but The Sacrificial Lamb by Josefa.
Okay, thank you.
An old one. It's absolutely stunning.
Thank you, Jill.
I'm very simplistic.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's good.
The best explanation that I ever had of this business of what we're going to predestination is that sometimes there are doctrines which are parallel lines, and we want to make them neat, and that explains it. But sometimes the parallel lines will just go on and on and on, and both are true. Yeah. And in our human, infinite way, we cannot totally understand that. Yeah. And I believe this is one of those examples. Yeah. It's two parallel lines. Yeah. Can I say something? Yeah, please do. Yeah. Again, my simplistic view, on the back of all of this, I can't imagine, as a human, being in God's place and accepting somebody else being punished, least of all my son, for something that somebody else has done. I think that isn't fair. The person who committed the crime deserves punishment. And so that, my response to this, and thank you to him so much, my response to this today is, how should we then live? Because that should provoke in us. It actually explains the verse, doesn't it, in James? It says, faith without works is dead.
Yes.
Because unless we truly grasp this, or when we truly grasp this, rather, that should inspire us to live and want to live sin-free.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jill. I think that's a great place to finish, because I know people want to come in. Let me just summarise some of that, Jill. I think you're right. I apologise for those of you who really wanted to get into the Calvinism, Arminianism thing, but we haven't gone down that route a little bit more, predestination and stuff like that. But Jill, you've summarised it really well, and I think I probably would agree that the Bible seems to indicate that to some extent both are true and run true together. And wholeheartedly support what you say there. That when you think about it, this doctrine has probably provoked the greatest hymns that we've ever, When I Survey, Amazing Grace, How Sweet is the Saviour, Wretch Like Me. When we really get a hold of this and allow it to change our lives, I completely agree. How can we live for ourselves such amazing grace? And yet we do. I do continually come back to the cross, see again his amazing grace. I think that's a good place to stop. I know some of you still got more things. This is hopefully provoked. Come on in, guys. Come on in. You're welcome to come in. We're finished here. And so, or don't come in. It's fine. So if this has provoked some questions to talk about in your groups as we do that now or later or whatever, then that's good as well. And I know that some of you are going to want to carry on the debate, but my mind is absolutely fried. So I'm really happy to hear stuff now, but I'm not going to be able to respond well at the moment. So I'm a little bit fried. So thanks so much, everybody. And we're going to just get into little groups and do whatever now. So thank you. You guys have been kind.
That's this thing.
Hold tight a second. I'm just going to sign off to you guys as well.
All this is based on